The following session is titled Introduction to Norms Nobility and will be presented by Kate Deddens, who is active in leadership within educational communities and homeschool co-ops and hybrid micro schools. Please welcome Mrs. Deddens.
Actually, can you hear me? Oh, yeah, but then I have to talk with this. So. I have butterfingers. There we go. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. Before we begin, Introduction to Norms and Nobility, I just want to ask one quick question. How many in this room have read Norms and Nobility? So, I just want to preface what I'm saying by if there's anything, there will be time at the end for questions, and if there's anything that you have any questions about, please ask, make note of them. If you look at my copy of it, you can see that it's very dog-eared, and there's a lot here, and it's easy to get distracted. So I tried to present something that would stay on track and help those of you who have not read it to gain an appreciation of it and then maybe to be able to read it later, sort of like reading an abridged version of a great work, right? So what I offer here in a classical sense is my narration. I'm kind of going to tell you a story of what I got out of reading Norms and Nobility. If there's anything in my undergraduate degree, which I got from St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, which is a classical great books college that teaches through the trivium and the quadrivium, it's that pedagogy, classical pedagogy, is mostly ad fontes, right? So you should be familiar, especially after a few sessions this week, with what that means, to go back to the sources, to go directly to the text itself, and avoid secondary sources. So this is my interpretation, which means that I could get things wrong, probably will, and I could have misunderstood some things. So I offer that. I'm not an expert on Norms and Nobility, right? I hope I have presented what he's written well, though, so that you can understand it. So that's my hope. The second principle is the best teacher is a good book, right? Optimus mager, bonus liber. So I quote him a lot because his words are better than my paraphrasing would ever be. So I hope you have some patience with that, but I've selected quotes to bring out the point in the direction that I think he was trying to make. So there's a lot of value there, and we couldn't possibly cover it all in one session, but welcome to an introduction to Norms and Nobility. I think it's one of the most important contemporary books written about classical education. The first thing that we're going to look at is what he describes as the aims of classical education, then the methods or pedagogies of classical education, then the characteristics of the classical teacher. He deviates a little bit after that and starts talking about the proper attitude of the classical educator to science. And he talks about the value of the classical education for democracy. And then he talks about the enormous significance of Christian identity. So let's start. I wonder what they do teach them at these schools. This is a question from C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, uttered in chapter 5 of that much beloved book by a wise and wizened professor. Allow me to summarize this section of the story. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, so I'm not going to go into detail. Set during World War II, 4 children are sent to the country to be protected from the bombings of London. There, while playing hide-and-seek one afternoon, the youngest, Lucy Pevensey, hides away in an old wardrobe to find that the further and further she retreats, the more it begins to open up into an unknown world. When she returns, she tells her siblings all about it, and they do not believe her. In fact, one of her older brothers, Edmund, who also found his way into the magical world of Narnia, exacerbates the situation by insisting that she's just making up the story. Concerned that she's playing deceitful and childish games, with them, or worse, that maybe there's something wrong with her, they seek out the elderly professor in whose home they are staying for advice. It's striking that when his opinion about the prospect of a magical wardrobe leading to some kind of mysterious world is solicited, the professor does not dismiss it out of hand as irrational nonsense. Instead, in the face of what seems like quite a tall tale, the professor advocates for the use of logic to ascertain the possibilities. To our modern sensibilities, products of contemporary education, this may come as a surprise. What on earth, we might ask ourselves, does logic, rational and objective, deductive and inductive thinking, have to do with the possibility of a fairy tale world filled with fantastical creatures in which time moves at a different pace and which can be entered through the most unexpected yet mundane means? A dusty old wardrobe filled with furs in a forgotten spare room, heavy with the scent of mothballs. The professor invokes logic, to the shock of the elder Pevensies, to bolster his defense of the probability, even the great likelihood, that there are profound mysteries in life. Eventually, speaking to himself in bemusement and somewhat sardonically bemoaning the fact that he sees no evidence that the Pevensey children have ever studied any logic, he mutters, "I wonder what they do teach them at these schools." So the fusion of promoting logic with the acceptance of otherworldly mystery, which the professor embraces in this moment, the one rational while the other metaphysical, is antithetical to the contemporary mind. Heavily laden with analytical and quantitative rubrics, such a mind struggles to even align the two, let alone reconcile them. Logic and mystery tend to strike our minds as enemies at arms. However, obviously to the professor, logic and mystery can not only live harmoniously together, but are necessary for one another for right understanding of the world and right action in it. He knows the older Pevensey children must make a decision about Lucy Pevensey's fantastical claims, and he expects them to be able to merge that which is rational with that which appears irrational, however uncomfortable that may make them and us feel. This is because C.S. Lewis, and through him his sage professor, comes to the situation with a definitively classical perspective. And the professor's implied question of what should be taught in schools in order to approach such a baffling situation, rightly, is precisely the one David Hicks explores in Norms Nobility. In it, Hicks writes that, quote, "The end of education is not thinking, it is acting. It is not just knowing what to do, it is doing it." The sublime premise of a classical education asserts that right thinking will lead to right acting. Right thinking, that is logic, defined by some as the art and science of thinking well, and by others as the study of the principles of correct reasoning, will lead the Pevensey siblings to discern the best decision about what they should do in this confusing situation. I, for one, am not only challenged, but I'm fascinated by this question of how to square the circle, if you will, by wedding mystery with logic. I've also spent many years pondering the question posed by Lewis's iconic classical professor, what in fact should be taught in schools. So both questions are addressed in Norms and Nobility. In seeking answers, this presentation therefore offers an introduction with an additional aim of preparing those of you who haven't read it yet, which was quite a few of you, to open the text and begin to read. Let's start by examining the aims of classical learning as expressed in Norms and Nobility. Hicks asserts that, quote, "The purpose of education is not the assimilation of facts or the retention of information, but the habituation of the mind and body to act in accordance with what one knows." It follows then that he proposes a holistic approach to education. It must address the whole student, his emotional and spiritual sides, as well as his rational. The aims of education, the teacher's methods, the books and lessons, the traditions and regulations of the school, all must express not just ideas, but norms, tending to make young people, he writes, not only rational, but noble. So we include good classicists who understand, as C.S. Lewis's professors does, the significance of logic. We know the best place for us to begin our journey is to define the most important term. So what does David Hicks mean by noble? As the heirs of the Enlightenment, we might take this to be related to class or birth, as in an aristocracy. And while it does carry that meaning, we all, of course, recognize that nobility also conveys the sense, as defined by a commonly used dictionary, in this case Webster Online, of possessing superiority of mind or character, or of ideals or morals. In short, when Hicks uses the word noble, he means that all these add up to virtue. To reiterate, he writes, the end of education is not thinking, it is acting. It is not just knowing what to do, it is doing it. And the sublime premise of classical education asserts that right thinking will lead to right, if not righteous, acting. So what he evokes is the virtuous life, the life the Greeks expressed with the word arete. Hicks contends this, quote, the life that knows and reveres, speculates and acts on the good, that loves and reproduces the beautiful, and that pursues excellence in all things. How we accomplish educating towards this end is the primary thesis of Norms Nobility, in which Hicks also endeavors to argue for a solution, as he puts it, to the paradox between educating for the world's fight and for the soul's salvation. As Lutherans, remembering our doctrine of two kingdoms, we can see here an articulation of the tension between educating our children for citizenship in the left-hand kingdom, motivated by guidelines and laws applicable to the three estates, the family, the church, and the state, while at the same time nurturing them in their faith as citizens of the right-hand kingdom, who are saved by grace alone. Adopting Classical Lutheran Education, published by CCLE in 2023, articulates it this way. Classical Lutheran education, being anchored in the historic Christian faith, has as its goal the inculcation of wisdom and virtue to raise up faithful educated people for heavenly and earthly citizenship. So as we gather this week to deepen understanding of classical Lutheran education, I wish to encourage you today. Because of our theological doctrines, we are in fact particularly well suited to balance this tension. As such, Lutheran doctrine equips us to have a uniquely fitting and fruitful alignment with classical education. Hicks is careful to note that, quote, to hold that virtue can be taught does not imply a belief in the perfectibility of man. Rather, it implies a belief in the ideal of virtue and the value of an education that embraces that ideal. As Lutherans, we would definitely agree. For virtue is not for the earning of salvation, but for endeavors in the left-hand kingdom. An expression of, and again, finding an answer in our Lutheran doctrine, vocational love towards and given in service to our neighbors. So for Hicks, as for the ancients, the telos or end of classical education is the cultivation of virtue. So what then are the methods of learning? We begin with what Hicks refers to as the word. The primary pedagogy of classical learning is the trivium, generated through language, the word, embodied instruction through grammar, and when Hicks talks about it, he calls it myth or mythos. And the dialectic, the logical structure of language, which he calls with the Greek word logos, and rhetoric. Although Hicks does not address rhetoric extensively in Norms and Nobility, he seems to primarily view it in terms of the paideia, or the content of cultural heritage passed down from generation to generation, primarily through things like literature and history, but as we heard this morning, also through hymns. It is important to note that although the language of the arts of the trivium are not whole, they're only a component of the 7 liberal arts, with the quadrivium making up the rest, the mathematical arts, I think it's accurate to say that for Hicks, the trivium is the foundation of all learning. This is the case both in terms of providing the means of acquiring knowledge, which Hicks reminds us for the ancients, particularly for Plato, is the activity of learning. That's really what he equates with knowledge, is the activity of learning, not simply the mastery of factual content. as well as communicating with knowledge and applying it. The word language and all the arts associated with it is critical, not only to education, but to thought itself. This truth is echoed in one of our own modern dark and dystopian myths, 1984, by George Orwell, in which language, in that book, if you're familiar with it, is being stripped down, simplified, and constricted for the purpose of political power. The protagonist, Winston, is told, don't you see that the whole aim of newspeak, the stripping down of language, is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. Contemporary educator and philosopher Peter Kraft echoes the fundamental truth of this in his book, Socratic Logic. Quote, if we cease to say it, we will soon cease to think it, for there will be no holding places in our language for thought. Language is the house of thought, and homelessness is as life-threatening for thoughts as it is for people. David Hicks refers to the trivium as the form of classical education. One way I think of it is as an artistic mold into which all classical pedagogical vision is poured and out of which all of its manifold fruits take shape. So let's look at this a little more closely. While the word as language is the outward expression of thought, Hicks defines the logos as the inward thought itself, or, and I'm not going to try to translate this, I'm just going to offer it to you, the intrinsic abstract rational principle governing all things. Although Hicks is not always particularly clear in his discussion of logos, and the discussion of dialectic and logos is a complicated one, I think one can safely say he might view the ancient understanding of logos as a kind of blueprint or structure of the rational connectivity and cohesion of our thoughts, right? He says that the logos gives reasonable explanation for man's perplexing observations and experiences of life. Alone, however, logos is insufficient. It needs to be paired with mythos. He writes, quote, to the considerable extent that questions of value, of right and wrong, of justice and beauty cannot be experimentally or rationally resolved, myth allows many individuals to share an epiphany, a vision of truth, granting them a basis for accepting certain normative standards for which there are no clear or convincing proofs. Right, Pastor Preuss was speaking about that this morning in the plenary. Because of this, the ancients understood that myth was a plumb line for virtuous living, and Hicks tells us that, quote, myths remind man to think and to act out of a sense of responsibility to the past. Those who forget the past are bound and condemned to repeat its mistakes ad infinitum. Myths inspire men to perform great and selfless deeds by assuring and warning them that their actions are not individual but also symbolic, and that the student of myths is transformed by them through his imagination. One of the most significant elements of mythos is the concept of the ideal type, a descriptive or prescriptive image. Its roots are in the ancient moral idea kalo kagate, the image of man as both beautiful and excellent. According to Hicks, the ideal type also addresses the questions, what is man and what are his purposes? We should recognize immediately that these queries have pervaded the great conversation throughout the centuries and are, of course, among the most important questions, likely the foremost of them, that we as classical educators ponder. The ideal type reflects the results of man's study of himself through time. So from Achilles to Iron Man, if you like. Hicks tells us that, quote, myths, whether they sang of the exploits of demigods or of heroes, caught in their perpetual flames a unifying vision and standard of man, striding between the poles of human strength and frailty. He continues, quote, this ideal type was at once immutable and unchangeable, yet ever in need of refinement. It was the metaphorical incarnation of wisdom and truth, both an elaborate dogma and a man. It defied comparison with any single man, yet all men discovered themselves in it. What made these stories valuable was not their historical authenticity or experimental demonstrability, but their allegiance to a pattern of truth, answering the question, what is man and what are his purposes? Hicks values the mythos in classical education so highly that he asserts that it is, quote, the very skeleton of civilization. Remove it and watch all the flesh of political stability, scientific inventions, and social sophistication collapse. Mythos woos imagination and sentiment, promoting virtue, while logos focuses on analysis, on making right sense of experience. Hicks explains that together, quote, both myth and reason are built upon the word, the primal word, and both influence the word. Myth hoping to enrich its connotative wisdom, that is what it implies, and logos attempting to sharpen its denotative precision, that is its precise meanings, how you would define it lexically in a dictionary. Hicks adds that, quote, one cannot maintain its identity and purpose without the other. Mythos and logos cannot maintain their identity and purpose without the other, no more than a wrestler can pursue his sport in a world of one. Of course, it follows that the ideal type also unites mythos and logos. It is mythically described while it is measured by reason, which assesses, quote, the distance between what man is and what he ought to be. So thinking of the plenary talk this morning, hymns unite mythos and logos in music, right? Which is rather a dialectic in and of itself, and we'll touch on that later. They present the ideal type by asserting truths, just like hymns will assert the truths. Sometimes seemingly paradoxical truths, for example, ones such as we are saved completely by grace, and yet we have an obedience element, right? We are saved by grace, but we should sing the hymns. We should obey that, right? Command. We might conclude that it is because of the absence of this entangled wrestling of mythos and logos in modern education that C.S. Lewis makes his often referenced scathing criticism concerning men without chests in The Abolition of Man. Lewis writes, in a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ, the chest, and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. From Norms and Nobility, we learn that perhaps it is mythos and logos that work together to cultivate the critical sentiment housed in the chest. Without their collaboration, man is abolished and becomes, according to Lewis, a being who is post-human. So let's pause and notice that Hicks has explained for us the interweaving of mythos with logos for which the professor in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was advocating. The mystery of the myth of Lucy's tale about Narnia becomes something that children can decide what to do about and act upon only when they apply logic to their experience of Lucy's character. And they know that because she is neither a liar nor crazy, she must therefore be telling the truth. If we view this according to the trivium, the grammar, that is, the facts and information in the story, is what Lucy is explaining about Narnia to her elder siblings. The dialectic, it's also the knowledge they have of her character, right? That she's telling the truth, a truthful person. The dialectic is their application of logic to that grammar, that information, those facts. And the rhetoric is their decision to act upon what they have learned. They decide the right course of action is, despite their own skepticism, to go with her to discover Narnia. So this vignette from the Chronicles of Narnia demonstrates for us Hicks' articulation of the purpose of education, that the end of education is not thinking, it is acting. It is not just knowing the right thing to do, it is doing it. It is no wonder then, as Hicks reminds us, that our cultural forebears considered the word a midwife of sound learning. It furthermore signifies to us that indeed what we ought to be teaching in schools is the trivium, offering the interplay of the mythos and logos of the word through grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, and that should definitely include the study of formal logic. It is interesting to observe in Hicks' discussion that through mythos and logos, that though mythos and logos have a synthesized dynamic, mythos receives greater attention and is more dominant than logos. Once again, this understanding of the pedagogy of classical education aligns with Lutheran theology, for we also intentionally give reason a ministerial and not a magisterial role. So now that we've laid out the aims and the methods of classical education, let's take a look at the attributes that he spells out for the classical teacher. According to Hicks, the classical educator has distinctly identifiable characteristics, and I'm for the most part quoting directly or just paraphrasing him, exhibits a temperament and behavior governed by ideas, putting thought into action and theory into practice, thereby modeling for students the aims of classical education itself. The teacher demonstrates a broad and penetrating curiosity, having a delightfully dialectical mind, which is eager to devise and test hypotheses and challenge ideas and observations. He or she habitually provokes and asks questions of no immediate practical value. The classical educator uses a great tradition of learning in the arts, letters, and sciences, the content of rhetoric, the paideia of the great books, the paideia of our hymnody, to excite in his students a vision of enduring values and truths. And he or she aims not to accommodate the mind of a child, but to form the mature mind of an adult. He understands that childhood is not a state of static being. It is a period of becoming. He understands that children desire to be brought up and to learn how to think and act like adults. The classical teacher grasps the imitative nature of learning, realizing that people of all ages learn well from copying, from imitating. And the classical teacher recognizes that childhood is a critical period for the formation of virtue. Though the ancient schoolmasters did not necessarily agree upon exactly how to nurture virtue in their students, some, like Socrates, saw the genesis of virtue through dialectic and Socratic dialogue. Others, the rhetoricians, saw it as gained through mastering the paideia, memorizing, epic poems, memorizing the speeches of the orators. But though they disagreed, they never doubted the necessary connection between education and the formation of virtue. Again, thinking back to what Pastor Preuss was discussing this morning in his plenary, education in the hymns is part of instilling virtues because they help in the battle against sin and darkness and fear. He gave examples of that. This was because the classical educator knew what kind of person, what kind of virtues he wanted to cultivate, and that these were the virtues of the ideal type. To put it in contemporary terms, he was concerned not so much with what the graduate of his school could do, but he was occupied with who his graduate would be. Hicks asserts that classical education seeks to habituate young people to act in accordance with all parts of the ideal type, encouraging them to engage in dialectical activity by discussing questions such as, what would human life be like without an ideal or moral category of courage? Could man survive without courage or ascribe meaning to his actions without it? Can we fully explain human life without taking an ideal of courage into account? I continue to quote, what is implied and demanded by the ideal type, as manifested in the mythos and the logos, is the central concern of classical instruction. All study, all thought, all creativity draws its significance from this moral preoccupation. Finally, the classical teacher, by emphasizing mastery to one degree or another of paideia, forms, as Hicks puts it, a profound and intimate relationship with his students. The activity of learning, in which they learn alongside each other and dialogue with one another, gives them common ground for friendship, and students become disciples. So we've so far reviewed the aims and methods of classical education as well as the attributes of the schoolmaster. What remains is to address the final components of those first 8 chapters of his book. The second part is more concrete in terms of curriculum advice and recommendations. But we'll begin by examining the proper attitude of classical education towards science. In other words, the appropriate approach to the quadrivium. Modern education has effectively rejected the word as manifested by that combination of mythos and logos, and has aggressively embraced logos in isolation, educating through heavily analytical methods, in other words, myopically STEM-centered, scientific, technological, engineering, and mathematical instruction, and it has wholeheartedly embraced education through reason in its magisterial rather than ministerial role. While David Hicks has much to say concerning the damaging effects of this on education, and in fact on society as a whole, in the main by nourishing a resulting need for an idolization of ideologies, such as Darwinism or communism, a large thrust of what David Hicks describes can be swiftly expressed, once again, by turning to C.S. Lewis and the Abolition of Man. Lewis pinpoints the fundamental flaw of a purely analytical mindset, which seeks above all to unpack, break apart, and pridefully, because it isn't possible, explain everything, and not only that, but to do so in materialistic and mechanistic ways with observational data and experimentation only. Lewis writes, "You cannot go on explaining forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see." An educational vision stressing the analytical and utilitarian methods of science, one which violently and carelessly wrests logos away from mythos and then makes brutally magisterial use of it, makes one blind. It ends up, quote, excluding huge tracts of human experience, as Chesterton put it, disbelieving in the soul. It comes to disbelieving in the mind. Classical education claims a right attitude to science in the following way. Hicks points out that, quote, classical education did not exclude science so much as it judged it of less significance than other branches of learning that promised knowledge at a higher level of being. The ancients perceived that though it is nebulously observed sometimes, there is a comprehensible logic at work in the cosmos, in the creation, in the world, through orderly structure of forms and harmony of activities, and indeed that these are inherently present in man as well, in human beings, but they didn't consider that the most significant aspect of who man is or why he seeks knowledge. Hicks explains, quote, "The ancient regarded himself as a microcosm of the world he inhabited. He existed at several inner levels of being that paralleled the world's outer levels of being. 1. At the lowest level, man's physical nature, his flesh and 5 senses, corresponded to the material nature of the universe. 2. The rational nature of man at the next level corresponded to the law, the purpose, or the logos inherent in the material universe. 3. At the highest level, man's spiritual, self-transcendent nature paralleled the divine creator, the lawgiver, the form of the good standing above the material universe. Man," Hicks continues, "according to this view is capable of finding some species of knowledge at every level of being, but only at the highest level, where he images his creator, can he find true knowledge of himself and his purposes. Because of this, why one studied science mattered more than what one studied." Hicks concludes that, quote, "Neither science nor civilization can survive in an atmosphere opposed to real thought. There is still a need to make man's knowledge of the observable phenomenon answer to his normative concerns. Even in science, what is draws meaning and value from what ought to be." For the classical educator, then, the mathematical arts of the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, harmony, and astronomy, and the sciences that were birthed out of that, are best suited to study for the purpose of perceiving the remarkably uniform order and harmony of all things. So that's as opposed to seeking it just for technological purposes. Not that those are bad, but the primary purpose is not the technological use of it. In this manner, the mathematical arts also, as Hicks affirms, quote, "contribute to the ideal type by giving a man a sense of perfect purposes undergirding all creation, and thereby putting him in touch with his mathematical awareness of transcendent realities." As James Nichol, author of Mathematics Is God Silent, puts it, for the ancients, beginning with the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, logos means reason, and reason is the main feature of everything. It is the root idea of natural law, and it's a common wisdom or order that pervades the entire universe. For the ancient educator, the interaction between mythos and logos is absolutely central to classical pedagogy. This tension-filled yet symbiotic relationship, when based upon, as Hicks metaphorically put it, a wrestling match, is actually a dialectic one in and of itself, and it is at the heart of classical learning. So let's explore this dialectical activity. Recall that we may think of the logos as the structure of the mind, of the rational connectivity and cohesion of thought itself, but it's not a static structure. It is in constant motion, seeking to bring harmony and synthesis out of apparent discord and chaos that man observes in himself and all around him. It desires to make sense out of mystery, just as the elder Pevensey children wanted to make sense out of Lucy's story. This activity happens unconsciously and continuously as we live and act in the world, but in the ancient context, so eloquently exemplified by Socrates in the Platonic dialogues, this process becomes a vital part of education, particularly when we become conscious of it and learn how to navigate it well. In fact, this occurs when we become aware of the order and patterns of our own human thinking and are able to engage in the dialectical pursuit of truth with others through conversation. This relentless interplay between mythos and lothos is a consistent dialectic dynamic striving for harmony in the midst of everything from misalignments to contradictions to paradoxes. This is the form of the activity of thinking itself. As Hicks articulates it, quote, the mind's habit of challenging the thoughts and observations originating in itself and in other minds and dialoguing until issues are resolved. That is, until things which are antithetical morph into things that combine and synthesize. So here we have arrived at an expression of the foundation of the classical spirit of inquiry, dialogue. Its purpose, Hicks tells us, is, quote, knowing the rules and challenging in both thought and action, not with expectation of being proven right, but with the hope of arriving through contradiction at a higher truth, a refining. Right? It's the refining process of our understanding. It's not about winning an argument. It's about reaching meaningful and actionable articulation of what is true, good, and beautiful. This delightfully dialectical mind of the classical educator engages in this action with his or her students, an activity which Hicks says remains man's best educative chance for tapping the knowledge of man himself and of his purposes, and for passing this knowledge from one generation to the next, and for repairing and developing conscience. A key term for Hicks jumps out of this quote, conscience. The development of conscience is normative, encouraging the student to seek a life of virtue. Hicks explains, quote, conscience is identified with the whole of knowledge, the totality of truth. It perpetually calls man to account for what he believes, first by stinging him when he fails to take responsibility for his knowledge and act upon it, and second by forcing him to weigh his knowledge of himself and of his purposes and find it inadequate and self-contradictory. Knowledge of our own fallen nature is always with us. Conscience negates or challenges man's present courses of thought and action, driving him to seek resolution to this challenge at a higher level of being, where his new knowledge will in turn encounter new dialectical challenges. Conscience urges upon man the ancient injunction, know thyself. It values not life, but the life of virtue. Furthermore, this conscience can strengthen its muscle. It can be exercised and trained by dialectic, norming a student towards virtue. So much in a classical education, Hicks writes, quote, depends on the development of conscience, the student's motivation to learn, his pleasure in understanding, in reading old books and in discussing new ideas, the quality of his relation with the teacher, his ability to be objective about himself and to discover in learning a way to compose his life. This normative use of conscience works relentlessly. Conscience commits the students to the truth, the whole truth, and it helps him to overcome his superficial, selfish, and utilitarian disposition. Ironically, the core of this dialectical learning is something to contemporary minds which are raised mostly on an analytical method of education that seems jarring, maybe even anathema. This core is dogma. Think of it the way Pastor Poyce was describing assertion earlier today. For dialectic cannot begin unless there is first an acceptance of that which is transcendent, of the ideal type which expresses truth, goodness, and beauty. Just as no arguments can begin without premises, and no scientific experiments can begin without a claim being made and a hypothesis that you want to test to prove, dialectic cannot begin without dogma. There must exist an ideal type, whether in the form of a hero or in myth or an established scientific truth, like the law of gravity, which can be challenged by the student in order for dialectical activity of questioning, testing, and drawing conclusions to flow. Hence, Hicks notes, the great teacher is necessarily dogmatic in the sense of being committed to ideas. He reaches the wills of his student as well as their minds. The noble intention of his teaching is to move his students to will a moral act, even if he's teaching Latin, as opposed to an immoral one. Whatever fails to evoke and develop a lively conscience in himself and his students is banal, mediocre, and empty of value. All of life, Hicks asserts, is the student's laboratory for dialectical learning. Dogmas, from the Greek word meaning that which seems good, which are thrust upon the student by teachers, by writers, by the very nature of life itself, become the student's hypotheses. Ideal types are pressed, tested, and tried, and conscience is developed thereby. Through dialectic, the student learns, Hicks says, what he must know to achieve full humanity, his obligation to himself, to others, and to God. He becomes a man who not only has a chest, but knows how to use it and strengthen it. This is the very reason Hicks argues that universal classical education is necessary to society, especially in a democracy. For the ennobling of the masses, Hicks asserts that, quote, a democratic society needs citizen body educated to make decisions about what it ought to be as well as what it can be. Furthermore, he asserts that to speak of classical education for the few is a contradiction in terms, for paideia is the inheritance of all men. Within a democracy, universal classical education will produce citizens who self-integrate and harmonize through dialectic, and in turn bring that harmony when they participate in the left-hand kingdom, in the affairs of the state. They exercise the capacity to make sound judgments where right thinking leads to right action, and such students want to know if something can be done, but they also ask if it should be done. They recognize the great human values and aims we all share, rather than focusing on disparate and fragmented ones. Hicks believes that, quote, democratic citizens are not born, they are made. They're welded, if you will, in the forges of the dialectical process. They become balanced and more focused on virtue and are more concerned with doing their duties than claiming their rights. In Norms and Nobility, we learned that, quote, the true source of freedom is the obligatory connection between knowledge and responsibility, for a man must be free to act upon what he knows. Here we have a very eloquent expression of what it really means when we say the arts liberales, the liberal arts. They are for the purpose of forming free men. Quote, a man without the knowledge of truth, a man ignorant of his obligations, and whose education has not aimed at instilling in him a sense of good and evil, has no use of rights. He has no knowledge of them or how to use them, except to infringe on the rights of others. David Hicks believes, therefore, that democracy should be normative. Classical education should be a universal requirement. All men and women must be taught that if they were the single torchbearers of paideia, to the extent that any society fails to provide a rigorous normative education for all, it creates a social, cultural, and political need for elite government. Hicks points out that it is a great irony that classical education, often accused of being elitist, is in fact the kind of education, perhaps the only kind, that cultivates an educated citizenry who can form a bulwark against the tyranny of the few. There's another irony that we should investigate. Although the ancient classical schoolmasters grasped the importance of virtue to self and society, and although they comprehended the connection between how classical education would, in an ideal world governed by the ideal type, cultivate virtue, they had no real answer for why such a thing would happen in the real world. On behalf of ancient classical educator, Hicks asks, quote, why should the student seek to perfect himself? Why should the student stand aside from himself and be always chiseling his own statue? How can a refinement of intelligence and sensibility save him? How can perfection of the self lead to transcendence? Most importantly, what is the transcendent justification for such a standard? The ancient pagan educators did not have answers. Without any transcendent justification, the classical education of the ancients could not and did not maintain, if it ever truly achieved, its laudable and lofty ends. Without the possibility of full integration through the dialectic of mythos with logos, disharmony and disintegration are inevitable. The fruits of self-centeredness and egocentrism and unrelenting quest after a holy grail of self-realized perfection ultimately caused self-interest to smother virtue. The ideal type, though it reflected in a multitude of ways transcendental truth, goodness, and beauty, was vulnerable and unstable. It could not withstand the constant barrage of dialectical action. What would be required to make the classical education vision effective would be an actual transcendent ideal type. That actuality, Hicks proclaims, is found in Christianity, in the incarnation, in the person of Christ, who, quote, reconciled the warring camps of pagan philosophy, the logos, and mythology, the mythos. Christ embodied the rational principle, the logos, in story form, the mythos. The story of his life had a point and a goal. It also presented a picture of truth, not simply a pattern of truth reduced to a number of generalizations. This picture portrayed a view of man that was complete and comprehensive in a way that no single myth or philosophy ever had been. It was inevitable that the influence of this amazing reconciliation be reflected in the paideia of those who share the experience of faith. As a result, Hicks emphasizes, quote, early Christian thinkers within the classical tradition realized that the answer to the problem of transcendence was provided in the person of Christ, the spirit of love incarnate, the expresser of the divine will, and the truly divine object that self-transcending love requires. Suddenly, there were divine imperatives for all the fundamental questions about classical education that pagan humanism could not answer. Why should the student seek to perfect himself? It was the will of God that all men should seek to model themselves after the person of Christ, the perfect work of art God painted in the flesh. The love of this work of art, because it was incontestably both perfect and transcendent, empowered man, endeavoring, perhaps as we would say as Lutherans through the third use of the law, to satisfy the demands of conscience in the earthly kingdom while relieving him, through grace, of the anxiety of conscience in the heavenly kingdom. Hicks reminds us that, quote, according to St. Paul, Christian paideia realized the transcendent objectives of classical education by offering access to the source of truth through prayer and access to the spiritual reality underlying the material universe, the logos, through the indwelling Spirit of God. At this point, Hicks continues, the Christian doctrine of divine grace rescued the pagan from his unfulfilled longing for a higher organ, and I think of the organ of the chest, such as C.S. Lewis discusses in Abolition of Man, that this would be adequate to know the answers to his perplexing normative questions. For whether he conceived of grace as the joint effort of man and the Spirit of God, or as the unique work of the Spirit, as we Lutherans would understand it, the Christian acknowledged the essential power of his faith to enlarge his understanding of the world and of his meaning and purposes in it. Christian revelation fulfilled the goals of classical education where pagan humanism could not. So in conclusion, we see that in Norms and Nobility, David Hicks has taken the conversation about classical education to some profound depths. He himself, acting as our classical schoolmaster, provides us with a model of the classical educator dialectically wrestling with his subject as he endeavors to explain its expression of the ideal, the true nature of the ideal, its foundations, and its intricate complexities. He has explored with us the answers classical education gives to the paradoxical relationship between mystery and logic. He has shown us what should be taught and how to teach it through the weaving a detailed tapestry of the nature of the classical trivium and the proper place of the quadrivium. And he has revealed to us that in the form of classical Christian education, such learning can be powerfully fruitful, both in the lives of individuals, but also to society as a whole across all its estates, as students are educated towards the cultivation of virtue. Is it any wonder then that our forebears, such as Martin Luther and Melanchthon and others, recognized the incredible value of such an education and sought to not only make it their own, but to provide it to all? Luther, in fact, encouraged setting up an entire school system for grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Lutheran educator and author Thomas Krokoc points out that, quote, the driving force behind this was the conviction that the evangelical adaptation of a classical education should be available to every child. Indeed, Thomas Krokoc writes in Lutheran Education from Wittenberg to the Future, the classical educational enterprise upon which the 16th century evangelicals embarked was remarkable. The scope of this ambition becomes apparent when one compares the educational reforms of the evangelical states, with the other countries such as England. In the early 17th century, England had 445 schools for a population of 4.5 million, approximately one school for every 10,000 people. In contrast, Lutheran states such as Wittenberg in the year 1600 had almost the same number of schools as in all of England, 401 schools in a state that had a population of approximately 450,000. This provided one school for every 1,100 people, and Wittenberg was not unique. So let us be greatly encouraged as we cultivate our classical Lutheran schools, whether home schools, hybrid schools, micro schools, or brick and mortar 5-day-a-week academies. We should be encouraged by the promise of classical education described by David Hicks in Norms and Nobility. It may seem daunting at times, but his work exhorts us. Is this kind of classical Lutheran education too much to ask? He answers emphatically that no, it is not. Not when to ask less is to make even more modest aims unattainable. Not when to ask less robs teaching of the intrinsic rewards that have attracted the best men and women of every generation. Not when to ask less cheats young people of their one chance to reach their full stature and to live freely and fearlessly in the mature possession of their rights and in harmony with the responsibilities that alone ensure those rights. Be uplifted. Metaphorically speaking, Narnia is possible. Because as David Hicks reminds us, quote, classical education refreshes itself at cisterns of learning dug long ago, drawing from springs too deep for taint, the strength to turn our cultural retreat into advance. So we have time for some questions or some challenges. Maybe I didn't read Norms and Nobility completely accurately. Yes?
What religion is David Hicks as far as denomination, or is he Orthodox or Catholic?
He is Orthodox. Yes. But that does not seep too much into his writing. I will put it back. Yeah.
How has Nobility shaped Cambridge?
Well, very gradually, because I've been reading it for many years. So, you read things over and over again, speaking of singing hymns over and over again, or reading things over and over again. I read it, it was published first in the 90s, right? So I've read it several times, and every time I get something different out of it. But I think some of the things which really are refreshing to me is the freedom that comes with that. For example, the classical teacher has the freedom to ask questions which are of no apparent practical value, right? We're free to go on bunny trails. We're free to chase squirrels when we're in the middle of teaching algebra and see what our students think and where their thinking when they converse with us and with each other leads us. Sometimes it leads to places and to truths which we never expected. Yeah.
And this idea of mythos is one I want to dig into a little bit more, because I think it's a word that can be a stumbling block to many who come from a Christian background. We have such a certain connotation culturally with the word myth.
Yes.
As Hicks uses it, and as people like Lewis use it, Lewis, right, he's going to talk about Christ as the one true myth, the myth made flesh, and the various phrases he uses. It's just a word that I think has so many layers of baggage in our culture. People who Hicks would call more lawless minded, who just say, well, it's all just a myth, it's all just superstition. Myth is a very negative word to us, and I think a lot of Christians are going to have a hard time integrating that into education because they can only see it as equating with silly superstition. So how would you advocate for reclaiming that word, especially in Lutheran circles? Do you think it has a place in our educational revival?
I think that not only are there ways to reclaim it, but that we should reclaim it in a sense. Biblically, it is used with a negative connotation of things which are just made up. but the sense in which Hicks is using it and the sense in which he is using it to express the stories that we have been telling about who man is and what his purposes are since the dawn of time have been addressing truths about what we are, what our place in the world is, what our relationship to the cosmos is, what our relationship to the Creator is, what our obligations and duties and responsibilities are. So even though you might look at a myth and say, we shouldn't follow Achilles' example. I mean, I think there probably was an Achilles of some kind. But even though we might look at that and say, that's just a pagan story that was made up, there is so much in the depiction of Achilles which resonates, right? The desire for fame, the desire for renown, the appreciation of courage, the appreciation of strength in battle, right? The feelings that we have, the great laudable ways that we act as well as the despicable ways in which we act. So if we think of Achilles dragging Hector's body around, right? So the mythos offers us not just perfection ideas, but where we fall short, but it shows us where we want to aim. And we're all born with that in the law in our hearts, right? We all want to be, I think we might agree, maybe if there's a pastor, maybe you can correct me, but we all would like to be Adam and Eve, right? Right? We all have this desire for that perfection. We all have this desire for the words of our Lord when he says, well done, good and faithful servant. Right? But these are stories that are told through history, throughout history, by pagans as well, because it's always been the story, right? And as Lutherans, I think we can take that approach too, that it's always been the story. It's sort of like the game of telephone. Things get a little mixed up along there. Yeah.
Did I understand, talking about the word mythos as being mystery?
It has that element of mystery to it. It doesn't always have to be mystery. It can be things which are paradoxical, though. It can be, yeah, go ahead.
So the reason why I asked that is because the Greek word mysterium is what we translate into sacramentum. So
Yes.
the mysteries of the means of grace.
Yes.
And in that, we can start to rescue the word.
I love that, yes. Very beautifully said, right? We are Christians who believe in the mysterium and the sacramental reality of what happens in our divine service and in the sacramental reality of what happens when we take the Lord's Supper. Those are not proven things. We cannot make a geometric proof about that. We cannot make a logical, rational proof. But when we sing about it in hymns, when we talk about it in good stories, and again, the paideia is the tradition of classics in history which are good, have withstood the test of time, we pass along to our students and our children this recognition of what can't be proven by the moment. Truth, goodness, and beauty that you can't express with a logical, algebraic formula. Music is like the concert last night, right? If you were there for the concert, the beauty and the transcendence and the glory of that cannot be, I mean, you can go look at the music and you can break it down into the math of the music and the notation and all of those things, but what it expresses cannot be shown. So that's beautiful, thank you. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Well, hopefully you can feel empowered. They're coming out with a new edition of this August 6th, I think, which my edition, I think, cost me around $50 many years ago. It's always been very expensive, but they have a new edition being published that's only around $25. So I really would recommend that you go out and buy a copy and read it. Thanks so much.